Blessings from the angels are flowing to you right now. You are seen. You are loved. You are divinely guided. Welcome, beautiful soul, to Angel's message for you. A sacred space created just for you. Stop everything you are doing for just a moment. Take a breath, because what you are about to hear is not something that reaches everyone. This message was carried directly to you by the angels, and if you feel a warmth in your chest right now, that is heaven saying, yes, this is meant for you. Stay with this until the very end, because the most important part of what the angels want you to know is coming, and you do not want to miss it. Something powerful is moving in your life. Something that has been building quietly, carefully, in the heart of someone who thinks about you more than you could ever imagine. The angels are here to pull back the curtain and show you what is really happening on the other side, and it is going to change the way you see everything. Your person has been going through days of deep inner searching, trying to understand how far this feeling could really go. There have been nights full of intense thoughts, moments when nothing made sense without a clear answer. But something shifted. Something inside them finally settled, like all the pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place at the same time. And now, nothing can hold back what is about to move forward. This is not about doubt anymore. This is about action. This is the moment when someone decides they can no longer ignore what they feel, and can no longer keep living far from what they truly desire. And what this person wants to live with every part of who they are has everything to do with you. This message is not for people who settle for less. It is not for those who are afraid to feel. It is for those who have the courage to hear a truth that can shake everything open in the most beautiful way. And you, dear soul, you are one of those people. Your person no longer wants to just dream. They no longer want to keep feeding silent hopes and unspoken expectations. This person wants to live, wants to make things real, wants to take a step that until very recently felt far too distant, but that now feels close, clear, and absolutely possible. Do not think it was easy to get here. There were real struggles, real fear, real moments of wanting to turn away. But this person grew tired of running, tired of pretending, and what is coming now is a mature, direct decision, made with the full certainty of someone who finally understood that some feelings simply cannot be kept inside any longer. Something very strong is about to happen, and the angels want you to be ready to receive it in the right way, with both feet on the ground and your heart wide open. This is not just a wish, this is a choice. And a true choice always requires courage. Your person decided to change their life, not in a small way. This is transformation, and this transformation involves you from the very beginning. There is a deep, clear desire to live something by your side that until now had only been imagined in quiet moments. But now this person wants to bring it all into reality. With action, with full surrender, with everything this feeling deserves. This person knows what they are doing. They understand the weight of this decision. And even so, they chose to go all the way. Because when love speaks louder than any fear, the path appears. And right now, that path is being prepared. The steps are being taken. The change is already underway. You are part of it, even if you have not fully realized it yet. This is not the kind of revelation that gets shared halfway. That is exactly why the angels came to tell you everything. Because you deserve to know what is being built on the other side. You deserve to know that someone who loves you is reorganizing their entire inner world to do something that can completely change both of your destinies. Life sometimes requires pauses. But that pause is over. Now it is time to walk toward what has been felt so deeply. There is no more room for distractions or excuses. This person's heart is determined to live something new. Not just something new, but something meaningful. something that will be remembered as the moment when everything finally began to make sense. This person wants to live a different life. A life in which you are close, a part of things, a choice, a priority. The angels are not here to push anything. They are here because this revelation has a very clear destination, your heart. Everything that is about to unfold is the result of a true connection that went through so much to reach this point. And now that it has arrived, it needs to be received with openness. Not with haste, not with resistance, but with a willingness to let something beautiful in. Because what comes next is something that can touch your life in a way you have never experienced before. You were included in an important decision. You are part of this person's life plan. And when someone places your name inside a choice that changes everything, that must be taken seriously. Your person is not just wishing to see you. They are preparing to show you through real action that the feeling living inside still beats strongly, and that it is ready to be lived in the most special way possible. Prepare your heart, because from this point on, every word leads you closer to a truth that was being built in silence. A truth that carries faith, hope, and deep courage. A truth that was lifted up to heaven with such intensity, and has now received permission to happen. Take a deep breath. You are about to discover what your person decided, and why this decision changes everything. The decision has been made. No going around it. No stalling. No fear hiding behind pretty words. This came from a steady heart and clear, organized thoughts. Your person chose to change everything. And this choice did not come from pressure or insecurity. It came because things reached a point where continuing the same way was simply impossible. Nothing made sense anymore if you were not included in the next steps. There comes a moment in life when we either settle for what is comfortable or we face what truly needs to be faced. Your person chose to face it. They chose to deal with the changes this feeling demands rather than keep trying to protect themselves from the intensity that comes with thinking about you. This choice required real strength. It was not made lightly. It was built through doubts, through challenges, through prayer. But in the end, only one thing became clear. It is no longer possible to keep ignoring what needs to be lived. This person knows that this decision can change their entire routine, can affect life as it is today. But they decided to move forward with courage anyway, because the feeling no longer fits into scattered thoughts or attempts to distract the mind. Something inside settled and said, "The time is now." All of this has been lived with deep intensity, not in a desperate way. More like someone who finally understands they are ready. Someone who no longer wants to postpone what has been sleeping inside them for too long. This decision to move in your direction was not made out of impulse. It was made consciously. Your person thought about you with calm, with respect, and saw a path that is possible, beautiful, and necessary. A path that would only make sense with your presence in it. And now everything this person is planning involves action. Not waiting for life to sort things out on its own. Doing what is within reach so that this love stops being just an intention and becomes something real you can both feel and hold. There is no more room to let time pass while the heart keeps screaming for a chance. That is why this decision was made with such firmness. Your person wants to live by your side, and is fully ready to stand by that. You may not even imagine how hard it was to break free from the fear of taking this step. But what won in the end was the desire for change. The will to live something new, true, and full of meaning. This person realized there are really only two paths: keep pretending everything is fine, or accept that you are part of what has been missing. And they chose the second one. Not to ease a feeling, but to build something lasting with real commitment. Everything this person sees, feels, or plans somehow runs right back to you. and this is not uncomfortable for them. On the contrary, it has become the fuel to act. What used to be doubt is now direction. And even if not everything is perfectly clear on the outside, inside, this person already feels in motion. They have already begun preparing, already begun clearing the path, already begun imagining the moment they can look into your eyes and show through action what they truly feel. Your person no longer wants to hide behind justifications, no longer wants to hold back words that need to be spoken. The time of waiting has passed. Every single minute is now being used to organize life so that this change can truly happen. There is a natural urgency in their actions, not from panic but from awareness, because the desire to be with you stopped being a wish and became a plan. And a real plan needs to be put into practice. Nothing is being done carelessly here. This decision was thought through, reconsidered, and is now being lived with total firmness. And when someone makes a decision this big, it is not because they are confused. It is because they understood it is worth it, worth the risk, worth the commitment. Your person is no longer looking for excuses. They are looking for the right moment to act. And that moment is approaching with steady steps. Everything began to align the moment this person stopped resisting what they feel. From that point on, everything started moving forward with more ease. That does not mean everything will be simple, but it does mean the choice has already been made. What is left now is the next step, and that step has you as its destination. This change is not small. It is turning the page entirely. And that is why it must be done with sincerity, because only then can something truly real be born from it. What is happening right now is not something temporary. It is an intense inner movement that keeps growing stronger. Something inside your person is pushing for a final definition. The heart is done asking questions. Now it is demanding an answer from life, and that answer passes directly through you. It is no longer about thinking about what could happen. That phase has already been overcome. Your person is no longer just projecting possibilities. They are seeking clarity so they can live what they feel. They want to step out of standing still. And for that to happen, a definitive step must be taken. This person wants to close the cycle of uncertainty, wants to leave behind everything that blocks this feeling and move forward, transparently, without masks, without barriers. Restlessness has taken over their days. Routine is no longer enough to distract them. Time feels slower. Every decision seems to point in the same direction. Something needs to be resolved. And the only way to relieve this tension is by fully owning what has been kept inside. Your person no longer wants to live between fear and desire. What they want is a resolution, not as an ending, but as a beautiful new beginning. With more truth, more commitment, more action. That is why everything now comes down to one definitive choice. There is no longer room to keep important feelings locked away. Your person wants to free themselves from the confusion and turn everything they feel into something real that can be touched and lived. This decision has been building for a long time. It has now reached a point where it can no longer be ignored. This person wants to stop postponing what they already know needs to be lived. And what is at stake is not just the future of a connection. It is the emotional well-being of someone who has finally understood that they need to live what they feel, freely, fully, and without restraints. All this person has been doing recently is looking for ways to resolve what is still open. There is no more going on as if nothing is happening. The heart has already said what it wants. It has already pointed to where it needs to go. What is happening now is the reflection of emotional maturity arriving at exactly the right moment. This person does not want time to erase what they feel. They want this feeling to gain space, take shape, and turn into action. Your person is willing to do whatever it takes to step into this new cycle. But to do that, old cycles must be closed. The weight of indecision must be put down. And that is already being done. There is no distraction that works anymore. There is no parallel path. Everything converges on the same place, resolving what is pending, owning what has already been felt so intensely, even before it has been fully lived. This person wants to stop leaving for tomorrow what needs to be resolved right now. And that includes meeting you, telling you everything that was kept inside, opening a new phase built entirely on truth. This desire for resolution has nothing to do with doubt about what they feel. Quite the opposite, it comes from certainty. When a feeling reaches this point, the only thing that makes any sense is to act. And your person is exactly at that point. They already understand what they want. They already know they are ready. What is missing now is the final turn. The one that changes everything. The one that allows this person to finally live what has been felt for so long. You may not yet know all the details, but what this person is living is strong, clear, and firm. Their heart is asking them to set aside every remaining fear and take this love on with action. And everything is pointing to the fact that this is closer than ever, because it is simply not possible to live in peace while carrying such a powerful feeling and refusing to let yourself live it. Your person is willing to step outside their comfort zone, tired of postponing, and now they want to resolve what exists between you both, not to ease their conscience, but because they have understood that you are part of what gives life its deepest meaning. This person wants to look into your eyes and speak without fear, wants the chance to build something clean, clear, and direct without hiding anything, without disguises. Just letting this feeling guide what needs to be lived from here forward. Their desire is to turn the page with courage, to put an end to the confusion, to begin by your side a brand new story, built with intention, with choice, with action, because there is simply no longer room to live as if this love did not exist. Your person does not want to live a half-lived life, and now more than ever, they are fully ready to face whatever it takes to love you in a real way. Your person has realized that staying the way things are is no longer enough. What once seemed acceptable no longer fits. And the change that is beginning to happen is not something small. It is a complete transformation. A genuine desire to break away from everything that slows things down, everything that weighs heavy, everything that pushes away what feels right. This person no longer wants temporary fixes. They want a new cycle, starting fresh with you by their side. The feeling has matured to the point where they can now see clearly what needs to be left behind. And this is not only about internal decisions. It is about choices involving structure, routine, environment, and relationships. Everything is being reconsidered. Everything is being reorganized with one single goal in mind: building a new life where this love can finally be lived the way it has always deserved to be. When someone decides to change their own reality for a feeling, it is not because emotion went too far. It is because truth finally made space. This person no longer wants to settle for days that do not feel complete. What is underway is a real plan for change, a process that takes courage, but one that is being taken with full seriousness. Because more than anything else, this person wants you both walking on the same path. Your person has begun removing everything from their way that interferes with this new phase. And this choice has nothing to do with sacrifice. It is about priority. That is what you have become, a priority. Not someone who demands attention, but someone whose presence simply makes sense. And as hard as it may be to change a life, it is even harder to keep denying what the heart has already chosen. The decision to transform everything comes from the inside out. First, your person understood what they feel. Then they began to act. And now the next steps are already being planned, not to prove anything, but to live something real. The desire to build a new chapter with you is so present that this person has been leaving behind what no longer serves any purpose. That includes habits, situations, and ways of living. Everything is being filtered through this one lens. Does this bring me closer to what is true? The feeling of being far from what one truly wants has been heavy. And that is exactly why this person decided to put an end to what has been holding life back. Your person has started taking real action to free themselves from everything that keeps this feeling from growing. This change was not asked for by anyone outside. It was felt, chosen, and firmly embraced, because continuing down a path that does not lead to you means denying what matters most. And right now, what matters most to your person is the chance to live something with you that has never truly had space to happen. Something light, direct, sincere, with real action and real commitment. The desire to be close to you has set everything in motion. Your person no longer sees meaning in maintaining anything that pushes that desire away. Everything is being reorganized with a focus on one thing, a meeting of two truths. This transformation is also a liberation. Your person is freeing themselves from everything that once made sense but no longer feeds the heart. Letting go of old fears. Releasing paths that caused confusion. Because they understood that to live something true with you, it is necessary to arrive light, decided, and whole. And that is exactly what is happening now. You have been a central part of this decision. Even without knowing every detail, it is your presence that motivates this turning point. It is the memory of what can still be lived that makes this person wake up with more certainty and act with more determination. Your person wants a life that includes you, and for that, they are willing to change whatever is necessary. Every action taken in recent days has been meant to move closer to a place where love no longer has to be hidden, denied, or avoided. A place where it is possible to know that everything is right, that what was once blocked now has space, that what once felt so distant is now happening. Your person is transforming their life so they can meet you with a free heart, a clear mind, and a soul at peace with its own choice. This person does not just want to see you. They want to include you in a new chapter. They want to share plans, be part of your days, build a life where you feel safe, valued, and truly chosen. And even though the change is not simple, it is being made with dedication. Step by step, with faith, with truth, with clear direction. All of this is happening while you live your days. While your routine continues, someone is preparing to offer you something that has never been lived before. A different kind of story with real commitment. Your person is ready to turn everything around if necessary, because the desire to be with you has overcome every comfort zone. What is happening now goes far beyond desire. This is not a sudden impulse or just any idea. It is a firm decision taken with courage and a full willingness to face whatever comes. This person understood that to live this feeling completely, a real stand had to be taken. And that is exactly what happened. They faced head-on what they once avoided and made the decision to live this love with seriousness. It did not come without effort. There was conflict, doubt, deep inner confrontation. But even through all of that, your person did not retreat. On the contrary, every uncertainty faced only served to show how present and real this feeling truly is. What could have been a reason to give up became a reason to move forward. Because this person realized that some feelings cannot be explained. They can only be owned. And owning something like that requires real courage. The decision was made knowing it would demand changes, adjustments, and challenges. because your person understood that life does not hand everything over ready-made, but it does offer opportunities to those who are willing to make things happen. This person chose to step out of comfort and take a real step, one that represents not only the desire to be with you, but the commitment to build something that can actually be held. Facing their own truth was the first challenge, and that has been overcome. Now this person continues to face whatever is necessary to set this feeling in full motion, because it is no longer possible to carry this love in silence. It is no longer possible to pretend everything is fine when the heart is asking for a new path. That is why this decision was not made lightly. It was built with responsibility, with intention, and above all, with courage. Your person is no longer trying to protect themselves from this feeling. They are opening up to it. They are facing life as it truly is, and even so, choosing to include you in everything. Not as a possibility, but as part of the plan. This shows that it is not about fantasy. It is about building something solid. About looking at you and saying through action, I want this, and I will do whatever it takes to live by your side. The courage to change everything comes from a feeling that did not fade. A feeling that remained present even on the most difficult days, and that now grows stronger with every small action. Your person is no longer waiting for time to solve things. They are shaping with their own hands what only the heart could command, because this person understands that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to act even when fear tries to get in the way. The decision that was made includes you completely. This is not a surface-level plan. It is something thought through with deep responsibility. Your person wants to live something with you that is light but not shallow, beautiful but full of depth, and that requires courage to own feelings, to stand by choices, to deal with the consequences of leaving the predictable behind and following what is truly felt. This also shows how much this person has grown. Before, there may have been hesitation. It may have been easier to hide behind excuses, but not anymore. Your person is different now, more willing, more grounded, more certain of what they want. And what they want is to build something with you, with presence, with respect, with partnership, and above all, with truth. The situation taking shape is not perfect, but it is sincere. Every action has been made with full awareness. Every step is the result of a decision that was felt, thought through, and embraced. And that changes everything. Because when someone decides with a clear heart, resistance fades, things begin to flow, and the path opens. Your person knows that not everything will be easy. Even so, they decided to move forward. They chose to take the risk of showing themselves fully, of facing whatever reactions come, of dealing with whatever arrives, because the fear of losing the chance to live something with you has become greater than any fear of getting hurt. That is courage. And that courage is setting everything in motion. The coming days will be marked by important changes. You will notice signs, but more than that, you will feel that something different is being prepared, because there is no longer room for doubt. This decision has already been made, and what comes from it will reflect the courage of someone who stopped postponing and decided to love in a real way. The plan your person is building leaves no room for uncertainty. Every detail has been carefully thought through, and within this new path that is taking shape, you hold a place that no one else could ever fill. This person is not making changes just for themselves. They are doing it because moving forward only makes sense if you are included. And this choice did not come from neediness, came from clarity. Your person has begun to realize that some people pass through our lives, but others stay within us in a way that no distance can erase. And you are one of those people. Nothing being planned right now would have any purpose if there were not a strong reason behind it. And that reason is you. It is your presence in their thoughts, the desire to share life by your side, to build a story where there is real connection, partnership, and truth. This person does not want to live just a moment with you. They want something that lasts, something that is nurtured every single day with intention, attention, and care. There is no intention of fitting you into just any small space. What is being prepared involves you from the very beginning as a fundamental part of everything. And everything that has been left behind has been left to make room for what can be built with you. None of this is happening by chance. Your person has already understood that there is no point in continuing to live a life that does not include your presence. That is why every decision is being made with a single thought: how to be closer, how to make everything more possible. And this person has been finding the answers exactly in this feeling that keeps growing stronger. Because when someone realizes they can no longer imagine a future without you, that is a sign that the heart has already chosen. You are not just a good memory. You are a reference point for the future. You are part of the plan, the desire, the goal. Your person wants to look ahead and see you as part of their achievements, their conversations, their daily choices. And that changes everything. Because when someone starts including you in what they are building, it means they have already understood that your value is far too great to be left out. Every action this person takes has been guided by this desire to turn this feeling into something real, lived, and constant. And that has led your person to move away from everything that takes up space without meaning. Because what is being sought now is lightness, peace, and true mutuality. This decision to live something by your side did not come from pressure or convenience. It came from the need for things to make sense. And you are the one who gives meaning to this new chapter. Your person wants to be where you are, wants to feel that you are both moving towards something that can last. And for that, this person has been doing what needs to be done. No excuses, no hiding, no shortcuts. This is surrender, but a conscious surrender made by full choice. Your person has understood that you are someone who cannot be compared to anyone else. That is why they are preparing to offer you something different. Something honest, something real, something possible. What is coming is not just an invitation. It is a decision that includes you as part of everything that can be born from here on. This person wants you to feel safe, to realize that you are not being chosen by chance, to understand that this feeling did not come as a distraction, but as a foundation for something real. All of this has been thought through, felt, and structured by someone who no longer wants to leave you out of the life being built with such care. You have been the inspiration for this change. Your person has been making decisions, thinking about how to bring you both closer. And that intention has turned into actions, small and large, but all with the same goal: to show you that you matter, that your presence is missed, that your absence carries weight, and that a real future together is sincerely desired. Nothing this person is doing is empty. Everything carries a clear intention, that you see how important you are, that you know you are not alone in this feeling, that you understand you are being included in something that goes far beyond words. Because when someone places you as an essential part of their life, it is a sign that the decision has already been made. And now all that remains is the final action. Nothing your person decided happened by chance. Every step, every thought, every choice was held up by something far stronger than the moment itself. It was faith that kept this person steady even when everything felt uncertain. By believing, even without having all the answers, your person found the courage to keep going. The decision to live something real by your side is directly connected to the relationship this person has with God. Before deciding, your person prayed. They sought answers not only in circumstances but in deep faith. They spoke to God with an open heart, without masks, without rushing. They asked for clarity, asked for guidance, and above all, asked that you be protected. This person did not act carelessly. They placed you in heaven's hands, asking that the path open not just for closeness, but for something that could last, grow, and bring real peace. There were moments when everything felt too far away, but your person did not step back. They remained steady, praying, asking for strength not to give up on what made sense. And whenever they felt weakened, they remembered the main reason, the feeling they carry for you. That is what kept hope alive. That is what strengthened every prayer. Because what is felt when thinking of you is not just anything. It is something that deserves to be cared for, built, and lived in truth. Faith was not just part of the process. It was the foundation. Through prayer, your person was able to see beyond the difficulties. Every word spoken in conversation with God carried intention. This person did not ask to forget, did not ask to be freed from the feeling. They asked to know what to do, how to act, how to draw closer in a way that respected everyone involved. And the answer came, not as a ready-made promise, but as a deep settling inside. A confirmation, this feeling is worth it. Your person realized it was no longer about waiting for life to decide for you both. It was time to act. But before taking any step, they sought guidance. They asked that everything unfold in the best possible way. They asked that even if things took time, that time would be used well, that every situation would strengthen the feeling rather than weaken it. And those prayers were heard. They were felt. They were answered. All the strength you may be feeling right now is a reflection of this. Faith has been the fuel for this change. It is not just the desire to be with you that moves this person. It is the certainty that something greater is guiding everything. Your person does not want to live this feeling carelessly. They want to do it the right way, with a real foundation, with direction, with purpose. That is why everything has been done with such care. There were moments when this person felt lost, trying to understand whether this feeling still had room to exist. But even on the hardest days, the connection with God was never broken. Your person continued to pray for you, continued to include you in every conversation with heaven. They did not ask for material things. They asked for peace, for open paths, for protection, so that this love would not be silenced. You were mentioned in every prayer with deep respect and genuine feeling. This person did not just want to get closer. They wanted to know if it was the right time. And when they felt that it was, when the heart was ready and the timing had been honored, the decision came. And it did not come alone. It came with calm, with faith, and with the deep sense that it is now truly possible to build something new. Your person is not acting only on what they feel. They are acting on what they believe. And that makes all the difference. Because those who act with faith are not guided by pride or anxiety. They are guided by peace. And it is with this spirit that this person has been preparing to reach you, to show up fully, to live this love with responsibility. What you are about to experience was asked of God sincerely. It was not a wish thrown to the wind. It was a heartfelt plea, filled with intention. Your person asked that whatever is lived between you be pure, light, and true. They asked that both of you be ready when this moment arrived. And little by little, everything is falling into place. Because heaven responds when the request comes from a pure place. This faith has sustained everything. It continues to be the foundation for every action being taken. Your person believes this feeling has a purpose, that it did not arise for nothing, that there is something deeply important to be lived with you. That is why they trusted God before trusting their own will. And that is why they are now prepared to act with full awareness, with respect, and with truth. The way everything has been,